Hi guys! In this video, we will be learning a case study for a contrasting urban environment, which will be Rio de Janeiro.
So Rio de Janeiro is a city in Brazil, otherwise more commonly known as Rio, and Rio is situated on the Guanabara Bay on Brazil's southeast coast. It is the second most populous city in Brazil, with a population of around 11.6 million people, and it's also got the second largest GDP of any city in the country, with roughly a GDP of, in US dollars, $201 billion. It is also the home of many of the headquarters of big influential companies in Brazil, such as Brazilian oil, mining, and telecom companies, and is also the home to many universities and institutes, and it accounts for 17% of the national scientific output. So as you can see, overall, Rio is a very influential and big and populous city. And it was also the host of the 2016 Summer Olympics. So that was just some background to Rio as a city. And now we're going to have a look at some of the causes of Rio's urbanisation. So Rio's population has grown over the last few decades very rapidly as a result of rapid urbanisation. So we'll know that urbanisation is an increase in the proportion of people living in urban areas in comparison to rural areas. So in Brazil, on the whole, there has been a lot of rural-urban migration, but also natural increases in the population in cities as well, because they have naturally young populations that are very fertile. So essentially, the populations are growing because there are more people being born than are dying. And millions of people have migrated from Brazil's rural areas into Rio. Currently, 65% of urban growth is a result of migration, and there's been a variety of push and pull factors that have attracted people to come and live and work in Rio. So the rapid population growth experienced in Rio has led to a severe shortage of housing, and we're going to have a look at some of these issues now. So some of the socio-economic issues tied to this specific population growth is that there's also a huge significant disparity between the rich and the poor people in Rio de Janeiro. So here we have an example of some of the very luxury style houses and apartments that you can find in Rio for the more wealthy population. And here we have a picture of one of the many slums, or what are called favelas, in Rio, which are very high density packed housing, usually on very much marginal land. So in Rio, different socio-economic groups, which means the different kind of economic status you have, are segregated into different neighborhoods. So there's a lot of social segregation in Rio as well, with people having clear boundaries between who can live where. So large proportions of the poorest population live in slums known as favelas. And this, as I said, is a photograph of a favela here. So in the favelas, 95% of the population are poor, compared to the 40% of people in the general population of Brazil who are considered to be poor or impoverished. So that's a really highly significant amount of poor people that live in these sorts of areas. And millions of people living in favelas have been forced to construct their own homes from scrap materials. Families often have a very limited water source, and they may have to share only one tap between a number of families. And because of the lack of infrastructure and the informality of the settlement, there's no sewage provision, and this can cause the spread of disease. And there's also very high levels of unemployment as well, which also leads to these favelas being big places to do with organised crime. There's lots of muggings, murders, and other sorts of things going on, like money laundering as well. So there's a very high crime rate in favelas too. So looking at the favelas in more detail, the favelas are located on the outer edge of the city of Rio in general. This is where the mountain ranges that surrounds the city. So the favelas are built on very mountainous and steep slopes, which is where the traditional residential areas wouldn't have wanted to build on in the first place. And this is normally because this is the only land available to build on within the city limits. And as I said, it's very much marginal lands, susceptible to landslides, and because of the very steep hillsides, which is very difficult to build on safely. So I'm going to focus now on the largest favela in Brazil, which is in Rio itself, and this is called Rocinha. And this is the size of Rocinha here on a map, this pink area. And you can see the size of this favela is absolutely enormous in comparison to the size of the rest of the areas of the city. So Rocinha, as pictured in these photographs here, is the largest favela in Brazil, and it's located in the southern zone of the city of Rio. It's built on a very steep hillside, as we can see, and it overlooks the main part of the city, and it's just 1 kilometer from the beach. So it's very hard to know exactly how many people are living in favelas, and it's estimated that the number of people living in Rocinha is between 60,000 people and 150,000 people. And this is because a lot of people are living here informally, there might be illegal immigrants and so on, so we don't have a very good census data which will tell us exactly how many people live there. So in terms of the number of people living in this area, in terms of population density, there are roughly 48,000 people living per kilometre squared, which is extremely high population density because people are literally living on top of each other in these makeshift houses. So the development of Rocinha, it used to be a shanty town, and with mass immigration into the city from rural urban migration, it became an urbanized slum. It has a lot better developed infrastructure than many of the other favelas, and it even has its own bus system, cable TV and banks, but it's still a highly impoverished area and not somewhere you would wish to live. As I mentioned earlier, it's very much full of crime, and it's home to most of the service workers working in the south zone of the city. And the favela is also home to many non-governmental organisations, which are staffed by Brazilian and foreign teachers, as well as volunteers and workers who are trying to improve the levels of education and the levels of development within the slum. This is primarily because in the past, these were seen as very much temporary settlements, and the city organisations and governance try to think that, they could get rid of these sorts of settlements. But now that they've grown so big, such as Rocinha here, they very much realise that these are now permanent settlements, so the only way to develop them is to improve the levels of many development indicators within the area by improving education, employment, healthcare and so on, and recognising this as now a neighbourhood rather than an informal settlement. So the Rocinha-Bairro Project was developed in order to try and improve the slums, and this is a project which has been occurring across Brazil in all of its favelas. And what it is, it's a self-help scheme. So the government is essentially providing materials to help the residents help themselves. So authorities in Rio have taken a number of steps to reduce problems in favelas. Some of the aims of this project were to integrate the favelas into the fabric of the city through improving their infrastructure and services. They tried to provide more low-cost housing opportunities and also ameliorate the effects of poverty through improving infrastructure, social services and land legislation as well, which is what I was talking about earlier, as recognising the favela now as a formal settlement. And it's meant to benefit 25% of Rio's favelas and illegal subdivision dwellers as well. So some of the components of the project included favela upgrading, so improving the materials with which houses were built, and also improving the aesthetic qualities as well. As you can see, many of the buildings have been painted to improve the aesthetics and make it a nicer place to live. Also, local authorities had provided building materials for local residents to construct permanent accommodation with, to make the accommodation much safer than it used to be. And for example, they've been providing things like breeze blocks and cement to build with. And the part of the self-help scheme is that the government provide the materials and then the local residents provide the labour to help build houses, and essentially they're helping their neighbours, they're helping everyone to improve their own community. And a lot of the money saved, instead of coming in, bulldozing it and building proper housing, is that this money can then be spent on providing basic amenities such as electricity and water. So it's a form of irregular subdivision formalization. So essentially they're formalizing the area and making it a proper neighborhood. And this is why Rocinha as a favela is now not seen as a favela anymore, but is seen as a proper neighborhood of Rio. So a lot of monitoring and evaluation has taken place in order to improve things like sanitary education and also institutional development as well, such as building schools and colleges. And part of the project included using grassroots infrastructure. So instead of the government going in there and telling people what to do, they've taken people who live in the community themselves, who know the technical aspects of the upgrading process, and they know the community as well. So this will help social cohesion within the area and reduce crime rates and just help understand how to improve the favela from within and understanding what problems the residents face and how they can then go and solve them. So finally, looking at some sustainability issues in Rio. Rio has done a lot to improve its sustainability in recent years, and it's also been the host of the Sustainable Development Summits that happen. And in terms of public transport, a lot of the public transport was improved in order for not only improving the social development of the residents of Rio, but also to get ready for the 2016 Olympic Games. So one of the first sustainable public transport systems developed was the cable car system, as seen in this photograph here, which is called the Teleférico do Alemão. And this is a public transport system which is meant to really help the isolated communities that live in the favelas, because obviously there's no roads or really formal pathways in the favelas. So a lot of people feel isolated that live there and they can't access the main city. So this public transport allows the people living in these isolated communities to connect them to the commuter rail work in the city, and it expands the residents' access to things like jobs, healthcare and social resources. So this is a really good example of how just a simple public transport system can improve socio-economic issues in the city very simply. The next was the development of what Rio are calling a world-class cycling network. And this was primarily to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the city. And it's now trying to make itself the Rio Biking Capital program. And in Brazilian, in Portuguese, it's called the Rio Capital da Bicicleta. And the aim is to build and develop 300 kilometers of cycling infrastructure in Rio by 2016. So obviously this was an aim for reaching this before the Olympic Games took place. So they tried to develop bikeways, bike path and shared street space with cars and pedestrians for cyclists, and also introduced a bike share program by adding another 2,600 new bikes into their bike share system, which is very similar to the one in London, the Boris bikes that was developed by the Mayor of London. And they've also developed a bus rapid transport system. In a lot of cities, they take for granted the bus system, so they developed a very good bus system in Rio, which serves 9 million people, and it also environmentally results in a 38% reduction in CO2 emissions along the main bus routes.
Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're looking for an amazing A-level geography resource, join me today in my series of engaging bite-sized video tutorials. See you soon, and together let's make A-level geography a walk in the park.